Morning. Morning.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Needs to respond.
Right. All right. We are glad to have everyone here on this morning. Welcome to Primetime at the BU Library. Before we welcome Em to the podium, we'd like to remind you that Primetime at the Bethel Library is an ongoing series for the Bethel community that highlights the academic work our community is doing, whether here or abroad. This presentation is co-sponsored by the Faculty Development and the Friends of the BU Library, which we greatly appreciate. Primetime at the BU Library's mission is to encourage lifelong learning beyond the classroom. It also includes presentations by the Edwin scholars, faculty, and student research teams, Faculty Excellence Award winners, student study abroad spotlights, not ready for primetime and ready for primetime faculty presentations, and talk about teaching. And also, you want to come back next Tuesday, November 9th. Bernita Masal from Nursing will present Fulbright in Sultanate of Oman and beyond. It's going to be a great presentation. And our presentation today, as you can see, the place of race and cultural nursing education, the lived experience of white nurse educators. So let's please welcome Ann Holland.
Thank you, thank you. I appreciate everyone who's here to hear about this. Some people have actually heard bits and pieces. Some of my colleagues have probably heard bits and pieces of this before. So, and I just want to comment that I think I have to say it's kind of interesting that my husband isn't here. Those of you who have done a doctoral dissertation realize that it's kind of like birthing a very stubborn, long overdue baby. And I think my husband is as sick of it as I am. So I asked him if he was going to come, and he's like, well, I haven't really planned on it. Do I have to? You don't have to come. So, all right. So today what I want to present is the topic of my doctoral dissertation, which I'm calling it The Place of Race in Cultural Nursing Education. And I'm a doctoral student at the University of Minnesota, and I'm hoping to defend this within a couple months. Yeah. So I started my interest in this topic with some study of the problem of healthcare disparities. And that's kind of, where the problem lies that, prompts this research study. And the data shows that there are persistent and significant disparities in health outcomes and healthcare services that are experienced by racial and ethnic minorities in the U.S. Things like mortality rate. The overall mortality rate of Black Americans in 1990, it was 37% higher than white Americans. And in 2004, we hadn't made much progress. It was 31% higher still. And there have been a number of metasyntheses of medical research, and those results have shown that even when you control for socioeconomic status and access to health care and other demographic and health risk variables, these persistent disparities remain, and these experts that have done these metasyntheses have concluded that there must be some bias and discrimination and stereotyping that's occurring among health providers at the individual level, the system level, and so there's been increasing attention to that problem. And so one of the suggestions that they've made is, well, we need to do we need to prepare our health providers, our nurses and our physicians and all those people to be culturally competent, that this is a solution to this problem of health disparities. And so in nursing, we have had some emphasis and push toward cultural competence education since the 1970s. And our accrediting agencies have written competencies. They've set standards for us for preparing our students to be culturally competent. And this is one model that's been developed by Larry Purnell, and we actually use this in our program in our cultural class. And so we made efforts to that, to prepare our students to be culturally competent. But within the past decade, there have been a growing number of scholars that have said that the cultural education that we're doing is perhaps just reinforcing stereotypes that students come with, and that we're ignoring an explicit focus on race and racism and the effect that that has on health disparities in our society. And so that whole body of literature really intrigued me, because we talk about race and racism in the United States, and it's a very contested issue. People have different opinions about that, and the general population varies in our perceptions of it compared to what scholars would say about it. And so what is race? Is race a biological reality? Is it a socially constructed kind of concept? What's racism? Is racism just an individual moral failure? Or is it a systemic concept, a phenomenon that's built into the very institutions in our society? And so there's lots of questions about that, and we as Americans struggle with some of those questions every day. So when we get down to this whole idea of cultural competence in nursing education, then the question that came to my mind was, well, I'm white, I'm a white nursing faculty, and most of my colleagues are white. And when we talk about, if we're supposed to be explicit about race and racism, and enhance that part of our education of students, are we even prepared to teach that? And so the demographics of nursing faculty are very white. Okay, the nursing workforce is largely white, 87% in 2004, and in 2006, 93% of nursing faculty across the country, that was a national figure, were white as well. So the question that kind of prompted this study is, if we're supposed to teach explicitly about race and racism in nursing education, how prepared are nursing faculty to do that? You can see on this picture I found on the internet, there's lots of white faces there at Purdue. So my purpose in my dissertation study was to understand what white nursing faculty who teach cultural nursing education think, believe, and teach about race, racism, and anti-racism. And I developed 3 research questions. And the first one is, I wanted to find out what were the actual life experiences of these participants in the study. So, and what did race and racism and anti-racism mean to them? And then I wanted to know, okay, so how have their experiences shaped their ideas about teaching these concepts to students, okay? And then what are their actual experiences? I mean, what are they actually teaching? What's the emphasis in their class? How are their interactions with their students and that kind of thing? So those are the 3 research questions. Now, I conducted qualitative research, okay? And in quantitative research, there's a real emphasis on objectivity, and that you set up your design of your study so that you as the researcher don't influence the results, okay, and your participants. But in qualitative research, it's much more of a joint process, okay? And so it's accepted in qualitative research that there is some subjectivity on the part of the researcher, because I'm interacting with my participants. And so it's important for me as a researcher to examine my own self and my own assumptions, and then attempt to, monitor that so that they don't unduly influence what my results are, okay, what my findings are, and unduly influence my participants. But so just a little bit about myself. Okay, because I want to be really transparent, and that's what qualitative researchers need to do, okay? As I said before, I'm a white nursing faculty, okay? I'm one of these people that, I'm interested in examining. And a little bit about my journey to this topic is that I came upon this interest in this topic when I was taking a doctoral level course at the University of Minnesota called Race and Ethnicity in Higher Education. And as part of this course, we had to do a lot of self-examination, we had a lot of assignments that caused us to reflect, and so I did a lot of reflecting about my own self as, you know, a person of the white race, what my childhood was like, what my interactions were like with non-white people. And so I discovered some things about myself. And I just started to recognize the privilege that I had as a white person in America. And, you know, I have lived and been educated and worked in predominantly white institutions all my life. Now, some of the things that I anticipated about my participants, okay? Well, I anticipated that they might also be like me. Maybe they also grew up in very white communities, didn't have a lot of exposure to non-white people. I was quite unconscious of the privilege that I had as a white person, and I anticipated that they might also be, that they might not, in their daily life, in their conscious awareness, be thinking about the dominance of whiteness in our culture, and how those things shape them. And I anticipated that, like me, the participants might not have studied about race and racism. They might not have done some scholarly preparation about that topic. I'd also anticipated that white nursing faculty who might participate in my study might actually be more sensitive to race and racism than some other white Americans because of their nursing background. Because there is a lot of emphasis on you know, compassion and caring, and some cultural emphasis in our education. Also, studies have shown that highly educated people and women may be more sensitive to issues of race and racism. And since I figured most of my participants were likely to be women, I thought, well, that might influence it. So those are some of the things that I came into the study with, okay, and had to kind of frame them and then kind of set them aside and know that they were there, but keep checking myself to make sure that I wasn't bringing too much of that in and listening to what the participants said. So I told you I did a qualitative study, and I was really overly ambitious, I've decided now, because I chose to do 2 methods. And I wish my advisor would have said, no, just do one. But I did a phenomenology arm of my study, and I did a case study arm of my study. And I did semi-structured interviews with 10 participants. I recruited participants from colleges and universities with BSN programs across a region, and chose 10 participants, and then I chose 2 of them, and I did a case study with them. I had the benefit of being on sabbatical last year. It was wonderful, and it gave me the time to actually do the case studies, because through the fall semester, I did classroom observations with these 2 case study participants. So I had to do some traveling and go to their classes and things like that. So I collected data over the fall last year. And then for my analysis, I had professional transcription done of my all of my interviews, and I conducted hermeneutic, which means interpretive, okay? Hermeneutic phenomenological analysis on the interview data, and then for the case study data, which included my classroom observation field notes, some document review. I did hermeneutic and categorical analysis of that. So just a little bit about the participants. I'm not going to spend time much on this, but I had 10 people. They taught at a variety of private and public colleges and universities. And their ages range from 55 to 65, 8 women and 2 men. So I ended up with phenomenological findings and case study findings. And my findings kind of came together in four themes, four phenomenological themes, and I want to talk just very, very briefly about them. The first phenomenological theme was living, learning, and teaching in white spaces. And what came through in the experience of these 10 white educators is that their life experience were very characterized by whiteness, okay, as I had found that mine were. Whiteness enveloped their early years. It was almost like a cocoon kind of experience. They grew up in very isolated communities, didn't have a lot of, experience outside of their communities, but then also throughout their lives, in both their personal and their professional lives. Whiteness was kind of an invisible force in their life. And in their teaching experiences, their classrooms were kind of an arena of risk and resistance, okay? And, both they and their students kind of maintained and kind of contended with the dominance of whiteness in that teaching experience. The second phenomenological theme that I saw was, I called it a personal journey toward racial justice. And in this theme, the participants shared a lot of personal convictions that they had about racial injustice. And that came about through life experiences that they had. And they had these convictions, and then that shaped their goals for their students. They talked about this process of becoming and this process of kind of personal change that was part of this journey. And even though they were in diverse stages in those personal journeys, their development actually, what I could see, it progressed in kind of similar ways. There were a lot of similarities in their journeys. And so for their students, they hoped to kind of launch them on this journey. And they felt that this commitment to racial justice was an essential part of nursing practice. But they struggled with the fact that, that journey is very individualized, and so they knew for their students it was going to be really individualized. And they found it a little bit hard to measure, too, what they were attaining. The fourth phenomenological theme was values transformed through human relationships. And in this theme, the whole significance of personal relationships with non-white people came out. And it was kind of like a defining thing for people. When they really met and got to know people who were not white, suddenly knowledge was transformed into meaning. They developed empathy for different people's experiences. And because of that kind of affective change that they experienced, they really saw affective change in their students. Okay? And so they talked about ways that they tried to stimulate affective change in their classrooms, not just cognitive knowledge, but getting to that affective level of learning. And then the fourth phenomenological theme, race at the margins squared in personal and professional contexts. And this theme really reflects ambiguity, contestation, marginalization of race in both their personal and their professional contexts, okay? What I found is that race played a really minor role in who they saw themselves as a person, very marginal impact on their identity. And for many of them, they talked about, kind of that unsettled nature of race and racism, how it's kind of ambiguous, and, is this racist, is that, or what is that, and they talked about their college and universities and about some of the ways that anti-racism was supported, but then also how it was kind of ignored. So a lot of contestation there. And this whole idea of race at the margin squared, it kind of came from one of my participants who said that in her course she taught culture And she taught it within a couple, like in the family course and the public health course. And she said, yeah, culture is taught at the margins. It's taught at the courses that aren't kind of the core med-surg stuff that we focus on in nursing. And so she talked about culture at the margins. And as I was doing my interpretation, I realized, well, if culture's at the margins, then race is at the margins squared. Because when you square a negative number, it's a more significant negative number. And so that's kind of where that came from. So I did case studies with two of my participants, and there were kind of four collective themes that I saw there too. And first one was that conventional understandings of race and racism. And in this theme, what I saw being taught was, I call it conventional. It's really non-scholarly understandings of race and racism. So a more conventional societal understanding of race is that race is biological. Okay, and there is really a difference. There is a difference between white people and black people, and and so that's that's contested in the scholarly literature. Okay, but that's pretty much how race was presented, and racism. I think many Americans see racism, it is an individual level phenomenon. Okay, I am racist, okay, and not seen as a systemic problem, an ideology that's embedded in our society. And so, what I saw was race and racism taught in those very conventional ways. A second theme was stories of life experience, and this links a little bit with the phenomenological theme of the personal human relationship, because both of these teachers, they shared experiences that they had, they told stories, and they wanted to use the stories of other people as well to help to create that kind of emotional connection and the affective learning in their students. And so that was a theme that came out in both of the case studies. Another one was historical educational practices, and in this one, what I saw was the effect of the historical curriculum and historical pedagogies, kind of content-driven, kind of lecture kind of pedagogies. And so there was an effect there, that was similar across both of the case studies. And then, surprisingly, fourth kind of collective theme that I found with case studies was technology as a constraining influence. And I'll talk about that in just a second. I wanted to give you just a little introduction to one of the case study participants. And so that you can kind of see, I hope that you'll be able to hear some of these themes coming through as I share a little bit about her. Janet, which is not her real name, was one of the case study participants, and she actually taught an online culture class. It was a 3-credit course that was dedicated to culture content. And she spoke very articulately about her childhood and about her life, about growing up in a very white community. She didn't meet anyone who was not white until she went away to nursing school. And even today, she lives in a very white community. And she really does not have regular interaction with white people or with non-white people. She went away to nursing school, and 2 of her best friends were dating black men. And she got to know these black men. They ended up marrying these black men, and her understanding of race and racism was dramatically affected because of those relationships. And she saw things very differently. And really, she had early in her childhood, she said she had a real concern about injustice in general. And then as a result of getting to know these black men, that really kind of translated into a concern about racial injustice as well. When I talked with her about teaching, and when I observed in her online class, that was kind of interesting, observing an online class. I got to just sit there at my computer, right? So, but in her case study, I really saw 4 tensions. Okay, kind of the thing that really stood out to me was 4 tensions. I saw a tension between individual conceptualizations of racism and systemic conceptualizations of racism. And what was interesting is that her understanding of racism, she was a little uncertain. She kind of vacillated back and forth, between, okay, is racism individualized, or is there this bigger system, social problem? But when it came down to teaching, it focused all on the very individual aspect of it, and she did not expand into any of these other thoughts that she would question them, and she'd mull them over in our interviews. And so there was a real tension there in how that got, some of her own personal beliefs got translated into her teaching. A second tension was a tension between her personal passions and her realistic expectations for students. She had a real passion. She was really personally saw herself as kind of an activist, because of her passions about racial injustice. And yet for her students, awareness was her goal, and that was an easy goal. And she talked a lot about how awareness wasn't really enough, but activism, anti-racism is scary, and about how that's difficult to, kind of present that to students and say, you need to be an activist, okay, in this. So there was a tension there. A fourth tension was a tension between past and current pedagogies. When she had taught at a previous college, and she had taught a culture course, and she had taught it a seated class, and she used lots of guest speakers, told a lot of stories, facilitated discussion, and she found that very powerful and moving for the students. She got at some affective learning in that way. And online, she taught 2 years at this university now where she was teaching online, and she was really struggling with her pedagogy because it was not affective, she wasn't incorporating these stories, and so she was struggling with how she could accomplish the kind of learning that she wanted in her students. And then a fourth tension was the tension between the ideal and the actual curriculum. She had in her mind, she was formulating in her mind where she wanted to go with teaching about race and racism. And she was, even over the course of the case study, it was really fun to hear her, kind of coming to grips with where she wanted to go with that. But then she had inherited this course, and there was content that needed to be taught, and the content was about culture, and the theoretical models were about culture, and so I saw this real tension, between where she had kind of a passion that was driving her, but where she was at the moment, and the challenges, the barriers of getting to where she wanted to be. So that's a little introduction to one of these participants. Just real briefly, I want to leave some time for just some questions. I have 4 study conclusions. Okay, my 4 study conclusions were that the whiteness of the participants' personal and professional experiences and contexts obscured their understanding of and teaching of race, racism, and anti-racism. I really felt that was seen throughout in various. There's various ways and to different degrees, but that was a conclusion. A second conclusion was that learning about race, racism, and anti-racism was best understood as a lifelong developmental process, and that it warranted developmental learning goals. And this is where that journey came in, that they hadn't arrived. They said that, well, I finally woke up when I was 35. Statements like that, things that, and so thinking about that in the context of our students, what do we expect? And we need to be thoughtful about that when we're planning about teaching these topics. A third study conclusion is that the teaching about race, racism, and anti-racism was most effective when grounded in relational, holistic pedagogies. And that came through from the participants. And the fourth study conclusion is that the participants were not well prepared to teach about race, racism, and anti-racism. And in most cases, they lacked both the intention and the academic knowledge to incorporate those topics into their culture classes. So those were my conclusions, and
All right. Well, since we have 10 minutes left, and
Yeah.
I want to leave it open for some questions and some comments from your presentation. So that's what this time is for.
I have this question. If these folks were teaching and involved in that, was the question raised why they did not seek out ways to develop relationships themselves with people of other color? I just, usually in a university setting, I think of it being a kind of a microcosm. I mean, there's many other kind of races, cultures happening. And I didn't hear you saying something about them seeking out so that they can be a part, so that can enhance who they are and where they're going.
good question. I didn't specifically ask them that. That would have been a good question. But I do, in the colleges and universities that that these participants worked in, they may have been a little more diverse than maybe some of their surrounding communities, but still very predominantly white. Midwestern, not a lot of diversity, and so some of the opportunities to just naturally do that, they might not have really found that to be really prevalent. Certainly within our nursing departments, if we relate most to our colleagues on a day-to-day basis, we're mostly white. But no, I didn't ask them about, whether they had sought that out and why not. I honestly, I think for most of them, it wasn't something that was predominant in their mind. It wasn't something that they thought about and intentionally focused on.
I have two questions. One is I guess I'm most interested in the relational holistic pedagogies or teaching styles that were effective. What, so you had examples of that from some of the people that you spoke with, and can you describe them a little?
Well, and what they, and of course, this is taken from what they characterized as effective.
Yeah.
I think every single one of these faculty had some sort of clinical assignment where the student had to they had to meet with somebody, and they had to talk with them, someone who was not white, someone that they had to meet with them, they had to find out, usually in the context of, their health practices and their needs and, how their culture, because these were culture classes, okay, how their culture affected their health and their health practices. And so that was something that they thought was important, and they felt that students, got a different perspective than if they'd just been reading a book. Some people taught in courses that had a clinical component. Other people, a number of these participants taught study abroad. And so it was, more those, I certainly heard that strongly from participants that had this, a very experiential component to their class and to some of their class assignments, rather than just, we're sitting in a classroom and we're reading books and we're talking about things, but we're not actually getting out there and meeting people.
And it's interesting to hear at the very beginning you said, they deemed as effective. And that's a whole another area. How do we measure
Right.
growth
Right.
in understanding self and others?
Yeah.
And I know Bernie and I were looking at evaluation tools to see how can we measure that, and we put it aside for a while because we didn't like what we found.
Yep.
From our friend Dr. Cote, it's
Right.
self-evaluation. I rate myself as sensitive. I rate myself as,
Oh, very sensitive person.
yeah.
Yeah, well, then some of the participants, they verbalized that, you know, how do we measure this? Can you measure outcomes about, you know, these things by an objective test and, you know, some survey? Yeah. Steve?
Your conclusions, I mean, knowing that this is from a nursing perspective, if I didn't know that and I just came in at the end of this, I could see the same thing for business, econ, or any other department. I'm curious if you've been able to process this with the nursing department to take the next step to ask, based on these conclusions, what changes might we recommend? And I'm thinking if you could just kind of say that generically about what changes might we as an institution make. Okay.
Oh, you're good. I'll piggyback on his question.
I didn't plant him there to ask that.
Brian told me to ask.
Thank you.
No, he did.
Let me piggyback on his question because it's related. Should the curriculum talk about race explicitly rather than culture? Because culture seems to be a bit fuzzy and more, but race is more direct.
Yeah, I concluded one of the things, the implications was that we do need to be more explicit about it because it just hides. You know, when we use the language of culture, we do not bring to the surface some of the ugliness, you know, that, you know, is in our society about race and racism. And so, you know, so to make those concepts explicit in the class, but in order to do that, we need more preparation to do that. Because the participants, very few of them had a grasp of vocabulary that allowed them to talk about those concepts in a scholarly way. And they had worked very hard at preparing themselves to talk about culture in a scholarly way. They had studied it. They knew the theorists. They used that language that those culture theorists had provided. But when it came to, when they talked about race and racism, they reverted back to the kind of social language, you know, that we use, that we're all, you know, kind of acculturated with. So they weren't very prepared to do that. So I agree. I think that that the implications from the study are not just for nursing. I think that they're for collegiate education as well, because, you know, whiteness predominates. So some of the implications is that faculty preparation is needed, that white teachers will be most effective teachers of race when we understand ourselves that we have a race, and when we develop in our own white racial identity. Because often we as white people think, oh, someone else has a race, you know, but not me, I'm white. That's not a race, right? And so then we're stunted in our understanding of the implications of race in our own lives, and understanding that in other people's lives too.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
Do we have a race because it's socially constructed, or do we have a race because it's biological? I think sometimes people are
Right.
confused about that.
Well, personally, now that I've studied the topic, I believe that we have a race because it's socially constructed.
So it's made up, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
So
but-
race really doesn't exist.
Right. It doesn't as a biological feature, and certainly the developments in, you know, unwrapping the genetic code have shown that, you know, like 99.8% of our genetic, you know, code is the same, you know, and that there are not significant differences between the races. Okay, it was, you know, and it's fascinating. You gotta, I mean, I'd encourage everyone to go and to read the scholarly race literature, because it's fascinating what occurred in America, you know, in some of the earlier centuries as we constructed this hierarchy of people based upon skin color, and then how that translated into advantage and disadvantage. And you know, it's really fascinating to read it, and it's very sad to read it. But you understand better why why we have social problems that we do, why individuals live in the conditions that they do, why they don't have opportunity. So, okay, so developmental, you'll see that implication, and then you just had a couple others. So those were some of the implications that I felt came from those conclusions. Read them. I'm thankful that you came. Thanks so much. Thanks to my students.
This concludes our session.
Thank you.
Very nice.
You all are welcome to stay and talk. This concludes our session for today.
Thank you.
Thank you.